Malware found spreading through sponsored ads on X. The leverage shift starts now. Here is the signal that separates noise from actionable change. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Not a rumor. Not speculation. Active campaigns right now, targeting millions of users who think they're clicking legitimate promotions. Here's what happened. Threat researchers detected coordinated malware distribution using X's ad network. These aren't random phishing links buried in replies. They're paid placements, the ones that sit at the top of your feed, wrapped in blue checkmarks and verified advertiser badges. Users see them, trust them, click them. And that's when the infection happens. Why this matters right now: X's ad system has a trust problem. When a platform sells ad space, users assume some baseline of vetting. They assume the platform checked the advertiser. They assume the links are safe. But here's the reality: ad networks are optimized for speed and volume, not security. Malware campaigns exploit that gap. They pay for placement, blend in with legitimate ads, and extract data or install banking trojans on victim machines. The scale is what makes this significant. We're not talking about a small niche attack. These are sponsored placements with broad reach, meaning hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, of users have seen these ads. Some have clicked. Some are infected right now and don't know it yet. Second problem: attribution lag. When malware spreads through ads, users don't immediately blame the platform. They blame themselves: I must have clicked something sketchy. That means X won't face immediate public pressure or accountability until security researchers publish findings. But by then, the damage is already distributed. Here's the contrarian angle nobody's discussing yet. Ad platforms actually benefit from malware campaigns, whether they admit it or not. Why? Because every malware click is still a click. It drives engagement metrics. It fills impressions. It pays X's advertisers CPM rates. Until there's a financial penalty for hosting malware, like regulatory fines or advertiser exodus, platforms have almost no incentive to stop it. They'll implement security theater, new review processes, updated guidelines, public statements. But the core economics remain unchanged. What changes next? This incident will force 3 immediate shifts. First, X will announce new ad vetting protocols, probably AI-driven link scanning or advertiser identity verification. Don't expect miracles. Second, antivirus companies will push updates to detect this specific malware strain, but new variants will emerge within weeks. Third, regulators will start asking questions. The EU already has the Digital Services Act in place, which requires platforms to police their ad systems. This incident hands regulators exactly the evidence they need to enforce penalties. For users, the practical implication is simple: don't trust any ad on any platform, including X. Sponsored links look identical to organic ones. Clicking is easy. Recovering from infection is not. The safest approach is to ignore X ads entirely, use an ad blocker, install antivirus software, or navigate directly to sites you trust by typing the URL yourself. For advertisers and marketers, this is a wake-up call. Your brand's reputation is now directly tied to the security of the platforms you advertise on. If X ads are distributing malware, some of that reputation damage flows to every brand that advertised that week. The smart move is to audit your ad accounts, check your analytics for unusual traffic sources, and consider diversifying to platforms with stronger security vetting. For X itself, this is the beginning of a credibility crisis. The platform already struggles with bot accounts, misinformation, and moderation inconsistencies. Adding malware distribution to that list signals a platform losing control of its own infrastructure. Advertisers will start pulling budgets. Users will lose trust. And that erodes the entire value proposition. The real question isn't how did this happen? It's why haven't we seen this before? Ad networks are high-value targets for malware distribution. They're trusted by default, scalable by design, and profitable for attackers. The fact that this is headline news suggests it's either new, large, or both. Either way, it's a pattern we'll see again across other platforms until the economics of ad safety change. This is worth monitoring closely over the next 48 hours. Watch for X's official statement, for antivirus vendor updates, and for news coverage of infection numbers. And in the meantime, if you use X, be skeptical of every sponsored link you see. That's the only defense you have right now. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.